Have you ever felt emotionally drained after spending time with someone, yet couldn't quite put your finger on why? Or perhaps you've been in a relationship, whether it's with a friend, family member, or even a colleague, where their behavior just doesn't add up, leaving you emotionally exhausted and wondering if you're being manipulated without realizing it? Well, you're not alone, and today, we're going to explore something that might just be the key to understanding why these kinds of dynamics exist. In today's video, we're exploring the psychological patterns that shape our relationships, patterns that are often hidden beneath the surface and are driven by unconscious forces. These dynamics can be incredibly damaging, but the most dangerous part? They're often disguised as something much more innocent or even positive. Whether we're talking about unconscious manipulators, people who wear a social mask, or individuals who project their unresolved wounds onto others. Jung's theories reveal that many of the relationships we experience are deeply influenced by forces we don't even know exist. Now, why should you care? Because understanding these patterns will empower you to recognize these behaviors in others and, importantly, in yourself, so you can protect your emotional well-being and build more authentic connections. This isn't just about others' behavior, it's about you, your growth, and your journey to true self-awareness. But before we jump into the video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe if you're enjoying the content. Click the bell so you won't miss any of our future videos that dive deep into psychology, personal growth, and improving your life. And if you feel like supporting the channel, you can donate through Super Thanks. Your contributions help us continue making high-quality content. So, don't forget to hit that like button, share this video with someone who might benefit. And let's dive into this fascinating topic. Have you ever been in a conversation or relationship where you felt drained, confused, or overwhelmed, but couldn't quite understand why? It's easy to think that these feelings stem from someone being outright negative, manipulative, or toxic, but what if the real danger lies in a much more subtle force? Carl Jung, the famed Swiss psychiatrist, dedicated his life to uncovering the layers of the unconscious mind and how they govern our thoughts and behaviors. According to Jung, the most dangerous individuals in our lives may not always be the ones with obvious malicious intentions. Instead, they are often those whose unconscious behaviors slowly infiltrate your mind, subtly influencing how you feel, think, and act without you even realizing it. These individuals, as Jung describes, are not fully aware of the unconscious forces that drive them, and because of this, they become a significant psychological threat. Jung's work on the unconscious reveals that much of what governs us is beyond our conscious control. For instance, many of the emotions we experience and the reactions we have to certain people or situations are not necessarily from the current moment, but are influenced by past traumas, unhealed wounds, or repressed emotions. In a way, we are all walking around with unconscious dynamics that can sometimes spill over into our interactions with others. The unconscious mind, which stores all of our suppressed feelings, thoughts, and desires, can become a breeding ground for harmful projections, especially when these feelings are not addressed and integrated into our conscious awareness. These projections, often unconscious, are where the danger lies. And when someone else projects their internal issues onto you, it can feel like you're drowning in emotions and situations that don't even belong to you. Imagine living with someone who constantly blames you for their own emotional responses. It's not that they are intentionally trying to manipulate or harm you. Rather, they are so disconnected from their own emotional landscape that they have nowhere to project their unresolved feelings except onto you. This is what Jung refers to as projection, a mechanism where one person projects their own unconscious emotions onto another. So, when someone feels anger or sadness, they may unconsciously blame you, making you feel as though you're the one responsible for their feelings. This creates an environment where you stop being seen for who you truly are and instead become a symbol for what they are unwilling or unable to face in themselves. The unconscious manipulator is someone who, because of their own lack of awareness, places the blame for their negative feelings onto you. And though they might appear as victims at first, over time, You realize you're stuck in a psychological battle that is not yours to fight. You may feel as though you're constantly trying to help them, but what you're really doing is sinking deeper into their emotional turmoil. You begin to lose your sense of self, questioning whether you're the one who's wrong, toxic, or inadequate in some way. The manipulator does not intend harm, but by failing to confront their own internal issues, they end up using others consciously or unconsciously as a vessel for their pain. Jung's warning about unconscious manipulations is one that everyone should heed. These manipulations may not be loud or dramatic. Instead, they are often silent, creeping in like a shadow that you cannot see but can always feel. In a way, projection and manipulation are like the slow buildup of a storm, which initially seems harmless, but before you know it, you're caught in a downpour. As the storm intensifies, your sense of self begins to deteriorate, leaving you emotionally exhausted and confused. This is the subtle but potent danger of the unconscious manipulator. Moving on to the next type of dangerous individual, Jung's theory also addresses the issue of the persona, or the social mask we wear to navigate the world. In our modern society, we are all familiar with the need to present ourselves in a certain way. Whether it's at work, in social settings, or even within our families, we all adapt to certain roles to fit in and meet external expectations. However, when someone becomes so identified with their persona that it becomes their entire identity, they lose touch with their true self. And when this happens, they not only distort their own reality, but also project this distortion onto others. The persona, according to Jung, is not inherently negative. It serves a necessary function by helping us navigate the social world, allowing us to fulfill roles such as the employee, the friend, the parent, or the spouse. But the issue arises when a person becomes so attached to their role, so invested in the image they project, that they forget who they truly are beneath that mask. This disconnection from the authentic self creates a void, one that others can feel when interacting with them. The relationship with someone who is overly identified with their persona can leave you feeling empty or disconnected, as there is no true spontaneity, authenticity, or vulnerability in their interactions. They become so polished, so controlled, that you start to wonder whether they are even capable of real, deep emotions. For example, think about someone you might know who is always on their best behavior, constantly pleasant, agreeable, and smiling. They know exactly what to say and how to act. But when a difficult situation arises, or when true emotions need to be expressed, they shut down or avoid it altogether. This is the bearer of the persona. Someone so focused on maintaining a perfect exterior that they deny their inner life, their struggles, and their real feelings. Their inability to show vulnerability can make those around them feel like they're walking on eggshells, always wondering when the mask will drop and expose what lies underneath. The danger of living with someone like this is that it gradually influences you to adopt similar behaviors. Over time, you may start to feel as though you too need to keep up appearances, suppressing your own authentic self in order to fit into the narrative they've created. When your true self is continually repressed, it becomes harder and harder to be genuine. And this subtle but powerful dynamic can slowly erode the sense of who you are. Jung cautioned that an over-identification with the persona can lead to a life devoid of true emotional depth, and ultimately, to a life that is disconnected from the soul's authentic expression. Another dangerous type, according to Jung, is the person who represses their own shadow, the darker, unconscious part of themselves that they refuse to acknowledge. Jung believed that the shadow is made up of all the traits and emotions that a person has rejected or denied in themselves, such as anger, jealousy, shame, and even hidden talents or potential. These repressed aspects of the self do not simply disappear. Instead, they manifest in subtle ways. And when someone represses their shadow for too long, it can cause explosive reactions. The owner of the repressed shadow may appear calm, controlled, and even virtuous on the surface. But beneath that facade, Their suppressed emotions are lurking, waiting for an opportunity to surface. When the shadow eventually breaks free, it often does so in dramatic, destructive ways. People who deny their shadow may have disproportionate reactions to small triggers, or they may harbor deep-seated grudges that they cannot let go of. They often see themselves as morally superior, yet their inability to acknowledge their own imperfections causes them to judge others harshly. I once knew someone who was always very proper and put together an ideal model of self-discipline. But whenever a situation arose where they were forced to confront their own imperfections, they would lash out or shut down completely. They had repressed their anger for so long that it would emerge in a way that no one could predict. Their repressed shadow controlled them, and they didn't even realize it. Their overzealous pursuit of perfection became a means of avoiding the darker parts of themselves, and as a result, it poisoned their relationships. Jung's analysis of the repressed shadow reminds us that what we deny in ourselves doesn't just disappear. Instead, it grows stronger, and if not acknowledged, it can become a force that controls our lives in ways we can't understand. Living with someone who represses their shadow can create an environment where nothing is ever truly resolved. Instead, there is always an undercurrent of tension, where suppressed emotions fester, waiting for the next explosive release. Finally, there is the psychic vampire, the most insidious type of emotional danger that Jung warns about. Unlike the others, the psychic vampire doesn't cause harm through obvious manipulation or repressed emotions. Instead, they feed on your energy. These individuals subtly drain your emotional resources, leaving you feeling empty, exhausted, and confused. They may act like they need constant emotional support or attention, but the truth is they have an internal void that no amount of your energy can fill. A psychic vampire often disguises their dependency as affection or love. At first, it might seem like they just need your attention or care, but over time, their demands grow more consuming. What starts as a request for emotional support turns into a chronic, unending need for reassurance, attention, and validation. No matter how much you give, they will always need more, and you will always feel like you're coming up short. Living with a psychic vampire can slowly erode your sense of self. As you become more entangled in their needs, you start to lose touch with your own desires and boundaries. Your energy becomes devoted to them, leaving you with little left for yourself. Jung recognized this dynamic as a pathological bond, where one person's emotional dependency prevents both individuals from achieving true psychic growth. In summary, the people who pose the greatest emotional dangers are not the obvious villains we often imagine. Instead, they are those whose unconscious patterns subtly invade our lives, gradually influencing our emotions, thoughts, and behaviors. By understanding these dynamics and recognizing them in ourselves and others, we can begin to protect ourselves from the psychological harm they cause. Jung's exploration of the unconscious mind sheds light on these subtle dangers, and by bringing them into our conscious awareness, we can avoid falling into these unconscious traps. Awareness is key to maintaining our emotional health and ensuring that we don't become unwitting participants in someone else's unresolved emotional drama. The unconscious manipulator is a type of person who operates in a way that is profoundly influenced by their own unresolved emotional issues. But they are unaware of the extent to which these internal struggles shape their interactions with others. In simple terms, an unconscious manipulator does not necessarily intend to harm you, but they use you as a mirror for their own unprocessed emotions, often in a subtle and insidious way. These individuals typically project their unresolved issues, trauma, and fears onto others. They place the blame for their pain or dissatisfaction on someone else, even though the real cause of their emotional distress lies within themselves. What makes this type of person so dangerous is that, initially, they can appear charming, empathetic, and even fragile. They may present themselves as victims, drawing people in with a narrative of being misunderstood, hurt, or wronged. As a result, they can gain sympathy, affection, and even assistance from others. The unconscious manipulator subtly manipulates those around them by projecting their emotional baggage onto them, making others feel as though they're the source of their pain. Take a personal example. I once had a colleague who was perpetually upset whenever something went wrong at work. No matter how much effort I put into helping the team succeed, it seemed like I was always the one blamed when things didn't go as planned. At first, I tried to be understanding, offering help and support, thinking I could fix the situation. However, I slowly began to feel an overwhelming sense of responsibility for their emotional turmoil, even though I wasn't the one causing it. Every time something went wrong, the same cycle would repeat. They would express their frustration and direct it at me, and I would find myself apologizing, trying to make it right. This led me to question my actions, and I began to internalize the blame, thinking I had somehow caused their distress. Jung's concept of projection, which I later understood, explains this dynamic perfectly. Projection is an unconscious defense mechanism where an individual attributes their own unresolved feelings, desires, or fears to someone else. In the case of my colleague, their inability to confront their own emotional struggles led them to project those struggles onto me, making me the scapegoat for their inner turmoil. I was not seen for who I truly was, but as a representation of their unresolved conflicts. This distortion of reality can be subtle but powerful. In the end, I was not only emotionally drained but also confused, unsure of whether I was the cause of their frustrations or if I was simply caught in a toxic cycle of projection. The unconscious manipulator's behavior is often not overtly aggressive. Instead, it involves small comments, passive-aggressive behavior, or even the strategic use of silence to create an emotional imbalance. These actions chip away at your sense of self, making you feel as though you are walking on eggshells around them, constantly trying to avoid provoking a reaction. Over time, this can lead to self-doubt and a sense of emotional depletion, as you begin to internalize the manipulation and question your own emotional reality. In this type of relationship, the unconscious manipulator does not consciously seek to harm you. Rather, they're projecting their unprocessed emotions onto you. For them, it is a coping mechanism, a way to deal with the parts of themselves that they cannot or will not confront. However, the emotional cost to you is high, as you find yourself in a position where you are forced to carry the weight of their unresolved issues. An important takeaway here is the necessity of recognizing projection when it occurs. Understanding that someone is projecting their emotional baggage onto you can help you avoid becoming emotionally entangled in their struggles. One of the most crucial questions you can ask yourself when interacting with someone who seems to be blaming you for their pain is this emotion truly mine, or has it been induced by someone else? This simple question can help you take a step back and assess whether you're dealing with an issue that belongs to the other person or whether it is a reflection of their unresolved conflicts. Recognizing projection in your own life can be a transformative experience. It is easy to get caught up in someone else's emotional world, especially if they are adept at making you feel responsible for their feelings. The key to protecting yourself from the unconscious manipulator is to maintain a strong sense of your own emotional boundaries. It is essential to remember that you are not responsible for someone else's emotional state, and it is not your job to carry their emotional baggage. You are entitled to your own emotional reality, free from the weight of someone else's projections. But the danger lies in not recognizing this manipulation. Over time, if you don't set boundaries and allow this dynamic to continue, it can leave you feeling emotionally drained, confused, and unsure of your own feelings. The unconscious manipulator operates in a way that gradually infiltrates your mind, creating a cycle of emotional dependency and control. The more you try to help them, the deeper you sink into their emotional web. What's even more unsettling is that the unconscious manipulator may not even be aware of the impact they have on you. From their perspective, they may genuinely believe they are the victim, that the world is conspiring against them, and that their pain is someone else's fault. This makes it all the more difficult to confront the issue directly, as they may not acknowledge or understand the harm they are causing. For example, they may blame you for not helping enough or accuse you of being insensitive, even when your actions were not the cause of their distress. Their projection becomes so ingrained that they may even believe it to be the truth. At times, the unconscious manipulator may act as if they need help, making you feel like it is your responsibility to rescue them from their emotional turmoil. This behavior could be especially enticing if you have a strong sense of empathy, as you may feel compelled to save them or fix the situation. However, the more you try to help, the more you reinforce their emotional dependence on you. What starts as a well-meaning effort to support someone can quickly become an emotional drain, as you give more and more of yourself to someone who is not willing to do the internal work necessary for their own healing. One of the most difficult aspects of dealing with the unconscious manipulator is that they often seem to be good people. They may appear sensitive, vulnerable, and in need of help, and their charm can make it difficult to see the manipulation until you're already deep into the relationship. Their ability to play the victim card, combined with their charisma and emotional intensity, makes it easy to fall into the trap. This is where the danger lies, because you're trying to help someone who refuses to help themselves, and you may end up losing yourself in the process. In the end, the best way to protect yourself from the unconscious manipulator is to recognize when you are being manipulated. This involves understanding the concept of projection and becoming aware of the ways in which others may project their unresolved issues onto you. It also requires setting clear emotional boundaries and understanding that you are not responsible for someone else's emotional state. By asking yourself whether the emotions you're feeling are truly yours or if they're being induced by someone else's unresolved issues, you can begin to take back control over your own emotional reality. By learning to recognize the signs of projection and manipulation, you can avoid falling into the trap of being used as a mirror for someone else's emotional struggles. It's essential to maintain a strong sense of self and not let someone else's unconscious issues dictate how you feel. In relationships with unconscious manipulators, the key is to recognize when their emotional baggage is being placed on you and to refuse to carry it. Once you learn to identify and protect yourself from this kind of manipulation, you can regain your emotional freedom and start to build healthier, more balanced relationships. As challenging as it may be, recognizing the patterns of projection in your life and taking steps to protect your emotional well-being can lead to a greater sense of clarity and self-awareness. Understanding that you're not responsible for someone else's internal struggles is a powerful realization, and it is the first step toward freeing yourself from the emotional manipulation of the unconscious manipulator. The bearer of the persona is a type of person who wears a social mask to fit in with society, their family, and their community. This mask is shaped by external expectations and social norms, which dictate how one should behave, think, and present themselves to the world. While the persona is not inherently negative after all, we all wear masks to navigate different social settings. The danger arises when a person becomes so identified with their persona that they lose touch with their true self. Over time, the distinction between who they are and the mask they wear becomes blurred, and they become increasingly disconnected from their authentic identity. The persona, as Carl Jung describes, is a social mask that helps individuals interact with the world. It allows people to function within the constraints of society by fulfilling certain roles, such as being a good employee, a responsible friend, or a loving partner. However, when a person becomes too attached to their persona, they begin to view it as their only identity. And everything that does not fit into this mask is suppressed and hidden away in their unconscious mind. This creates a dangerous disconnection between the person's true self and the role they play. And the longer this goes unrecognized, the more toxic it becomes, both for the individual and those around them. Imagine having a friend who always seems perfect, polite, charming, and saying the right things at the right time. They seem to avoid conflict at all costs, always maintaining a positive and controlled demeanor. They appear to have it all together. with no visible flaws or vulnerabilities. In social settings, they may be the life of the party, telling jokes, engaging in lively conversation, and creating an atmosphere of ease and comfort. They wear their mask so well that you begin to admire their ability to navigate life with such grace and poise. However, when a challenging situation arises, something unexpected happens. Their mask slips, and the true person underneath is nowhere to be found. What once appeared to be a well-adjusted, perfect individual now seems fragile and disconnected, unable to handle the situation with the same calmness they've shown in the past. This is exactly what happened with a friend of mine. On the surface, she appeared to be the ideal person, always composed, saying the right things, and acting in a way that seemed to make everyone around her feel comfortable and at ease. But when we found ourselves in a difficult situation, her carefully crafted persona collapsed. Suddenly, she was no longer the confident, assured person I thought I knew. Instead, she became defensive, confused, and disconnected. It was as if the mask she had been wearing for so long could no longer hold up under the weight of genuine emotions. What struck me most was the emptiness that followed. There was no deeper layer to her personality. The mask had become so ingrained that she had lost sight of who she truly was. And this disconnection left a void that affected not only her sense of self, but also my own understanding of her. In this situation, the danger wasn't just in the loss of authenticity, it was in how the lack of a genuine self created a ripple effect that left everyone around her feeling uncertain and unsure. I began to question my own self-perception and wondered if I, too, was wearing a mask in order to fit into the expectations of others. Her sudden vulnerability made me realize that I had been unknowingly caught in a dynamic where I was admiring a facade, not the true person underneath. The experience of living with someone who identifies too strongly with their persona can create an environment where everyone involved feels disconnected from their own authentic selves. In this case, her persona was a barrier not just between herself and the world, but also between herself and me. Jung's concept of the persona suggests that we all wear different masks depending on the situation at work, with our friends, and even with family. The persona allows us to adapt to the role society expects of us. But when we start to see the persona as the only version of ourselves that matters, we risk losing sight of our true identity. This is especially problematic when someone becomes so attached to their persona that they suppress any vulnerability, imperfection, or authentic emotion that doesn't fit within the boundaries of the role they are playing. Over time, this leads to a profound sense of emptiness and disconnection, not just for the person wearing the mask, but for everyone around them who begins to feel that something is missing. Living with someone who has become overly identified with their persona can create a toxic dynamic, as the person may feel trapped in a role that is not authentic to who they really are. They might continually suppress their own feelings, desires, and emotions to maintain the facade of being perfect. This becomes emotionally exhausting, both for the individual and for the people they interact with. Relationships become shallow and one-dimensional, as everything is filtered through the lens of the persona. There is no room for true emotional depth or vulnerability, because the person feels the constant pressure to perform in a way that fits into the expectations of others. Over time, this can cause significant emotional distress, as the person becomes increasingly disconnected from their true self and is left with a sense of isolation and inner conflict. Take, for example, the case of a colleague who works tirelessly to maintain the image of being the perfect professional. They always dress impeccably, never speak out of turn, and adhere strictly to the expectations of their job. On the surface, they seem to be the model employee, polite, efficient, and always willing to go the extra mile. However, when a mistake is made or a conflict arises, this carefully crafted persona begins to crack. Instead of acknowledging their vulnerability or mistakes, they become defensive, unable to show any human emotion or imperfection. This rigidity makes them difficult to relate to, and it can create a work environment that feels cold and inauthentic. Over time, others around them may start to feel the pressure to maintain their own personas, leading to a workplace that lacks emotional depth and true connection. In relationships, the effects of identifying too strongly with the persona can be even more damaging. If one partner is so consumed by their social mask that they cannot show their true self, the relationship may become one-sided and emotionally shallow. The partner who wears the mask may begin to feel as though they are playing a role, rather than experiencing real intimacy and connection. Meanwhile, the other partner may feel increasingly disconnected, unsure of who they are really in a relationship with. This disconnect can lead to frustration, confusion, and a sense of loneliness, even when both individuals are physically present. Jung's theory of the persona reminds us that while we all have roles to play, it's essential to remember that these roles should not define us entirely. We are more than just the masks we wear in social settings. We are complex, multifaceted beings with a deep well of emotions, desires, and thoughts that are not always aligned with external expectations. It's crucial to maintain a balance between fulfilling our social roles and staying in touch with our authentic self. Otherwise, we risk losing our true identity and becoming trapped in a cycle of superficiality and emotional disconnection. The key takeaway here is that living with someone who is overly attached to their persona can create a toxic environment, not just for them, but for those around them. The persona becomes a barrier between the individual and their true self, leaving them disconnected from their own emotions and, in turn, from the people who care about them. It's essential to recognize the roles we play and the personas we adopt, but we must also make space for our true selves to emerge. If we don't, we risk becoming trapped in a false identity. It's important to ask ourselves whether we are acting out of our authentic self or merely playing a role to fit in. When we begin to identify too strongly with our persona, we lose touch with the deeper parts of ourselves that make us who we truly are. The more we cling to the mask, the further we drift from our authentic identity, and ultimately with ourselves. The owner of the repressed shadow is a person who, on the surface, appears calm, collected, and composed, but beneath this exterior lies a well of unaddressed emotions. These individuals repress their darker feelings, anger, jealousy, envy, and sometimes even their desires or ambitions in an effort to maintain an image of control and perfection. For them, any hint of vulnerability or imperfection is intolerable, and they go to great lengths to suppress anything that could disrupt their carefully crafted image. However, as Carl Jung observed, repressed emotions do not simply vanish. They accumulate in the unconscious, festering and waiting for a moment when they will inevitably break free. When they do, the explosion can be violent, surprising, and incredibly damaging to everyone around them. The repressed shadow, as Jung termed it, is the hidden, often dark side of our personalities, those parts of ourselves that we refuse to acknowledge or confront. These are the feelings, thoughts, or desires that society, family, or even our own moral compass deems unacceptable. Rather than integrating these aspects into our conscious awareness, we push them down, hoping they will go away. However, Jung argued that this repression only intensifies these emotions, and what we refuse to face in ourselves will eventually find a way to manifest, often in destructive ways. I once knew someone who prided themselves on being the moral compass of our friend group. They were always the one to offer advice on how others should behave, what was right, and what was wrong. This person presented themselves as a paragon of virtue, calm, rational, and emotionally controlled. Their conversations often revolved around ideals of fairness, justice, and self-discipline. It was almost as if they wore the mask of a perfect individual, and I admired their consistency in trying to live up to such high standards. They made it clear that they valued moral authority and viewed themselves as a guide to others, someone who could always be relied upon to offer sage advice. However, over time, I began to notice a growing tension beneath their polished exterior. Despite their calm demeanor, they could not tolerate imperfection either in themselves or others. If someone in our circle made a mistake or expressed an emotion they deemed inappropriate, this person would recoil, often offering judgment or correction in a way that made others feel small or unworthy. They could not accept emotional outbursts, frustration, or sadness. These displays of vulnerability seemed to trigger something in them, and instead of responding with compassion or understanding, they would criticize or dismiss the feelings of others. It was as if the very existence of imperfection threatened their carefully cultivated sense of control. One day, this person's emotional suppression finally caught up with them. A minor issue arose in our group, a disagreement over a trivial matter, but it triggered an unexpected and intense reaction from them. The calm, collected persona they had so carefully constructed shattered in an instant. They became enraged, shouting at the group, accusing everyone of being irresponsible and ungrateful. The explosion was nothing short of startling. For someone who had always presented themselves as calm and composed, this outburst was like a storm breaking through a calm sky. It was as though all the anger, frustration, and judgment they had been repressing for years suddenly surged forth in a violent eruption. What was most striking was the aftermath of this emotional explosion. It wasn't just the anger that was shocking, it was the sheer intensity of the emotions that had been bottled up for so long. The explosion was disproportionate to the situation at hand, and it left everyone in the group feeling shaken and confused. For a moment, we all questioned who this person really was. The calm facade had been shattered, revealing the depth of repressed anger and frustration that had been lurking just beneath the surface. What had been a minor disagreement became a full-blown emotional crisis that left lasting scars on our relationships. The person who had prided themselves on being the moral authority was now seen in a completely different light, and their outburst became a defining moment for our group dynamic. Jung's teachings on repression and the shadow offer an important lesson here. Repressed emotions do not disappear. They do not simply fade away because we refuse to acknowledge them. Instead, they accumulate in the unconscious mind, waiting for the moment when they can no longer be contained. When those emotions finally erupt, the consequences can be devastating for everyone involved. Repressed anger, in particular, can be especially harmful because it tends to build over time. The longer it is suppressed, the more intense and uncontrollable it becomes when it finally surfaces. The person who has spent years hiding their anger may not even recognize it when it erupts, but others around them will feel the destructive impact of that suppressed emotion. What makes the owner of the repressed shadow so dangerous is that their emotional explosion is often unpredictable. Unlike individuals who consciously express their anger or frustration, the person who represses their emotions can go for long periods without showing any signs of distress. They might appear perfectly fine on the outside, and even convince themselves that they are in control of their feelings. But this false sense of control is fragile. When they are faced with a situation that threatens their carefully constructed persona, the repressed emotions burst forth with an intensity that can overwhelm everyone around them. This type of repression also prevents the individual from dealing with their emotions in a healthy way. Instead of acknowledging their anger, jealousy, or frustration and working through it, they push those feelings aside, believing that if they ignore them long enough, they will go away. However, as Jung warned, the shadow is not something that can simply be wished away. It must be integrated into our consciousness, acknowledged and understood. Only then can we achieve a sense of balance and wholeness. By denying the existence of these darker emotions, the individual creates a rift within themselves, which will inevitably have negative consequences in their relationships and overall well-being. The repressed shadow also affects how the individual perceives others. Because they are unable or unwilling to face their own flaws, they may project their repressed anger or frustration onto others. For example, someone who has repressed their jealousy might react with unnecessary suspicion toward others, interpreting innocent actions as signs of betrayal. Similarly, Someone who represses their feelings of inadequacy might project their own insecurities onto others, criticizing them for things they secretly fear about themselves. The person who has not integrated their shadow can become blind to their own emotional needs and the needs of those around them, creating a toxic dynamic where they are constantly reacting from a place of unconscious emotional pain. Living with the owner of the repressed shadow can be exhausting. The person may seem perfect on the surface, but their inability to express their true emotions leads to an internal conflict that affects everyone around them. They may seem calm and collected one moment, and then explode in anger or frustration the next. This emotional instability can leave others feeling constantly on edge, never knowing when the next emotional outburst will occur. The unpredictable nature of their emotions can make it difficult for others to trust them or feel secure in their relationships with them. One of the key takeaways from Jung's teachings on repression and the shadow is that repressed emotions don't just disappear. They don't go away simply because we choose to ignore them. Instead, they accumulate in the unconscious mind, and when they finally come to the surface, they can cause significant damage to both the individual and those around them. The longer we repress our emotions, the more intense and uncontrollable they become when they finally emerge. Whether it's anger, jealousy, or frustration, these emotions must be acknowledged and dealt with in order to prevent them from becoming destructive. For anyone living with the owner of the repressed shadow, the lesson is clear. Repressed emotions are not just an internal issue. They have real, tangible consequences in the external world. If you're struggling with repressed emotions, it's important to seek help and find ways to address them in a healthy, constructive manner. Ignoring them may seem like a solution in the short term, but in the long run, it only leads to greater emotional pain and destruction. Likewise, if you find yourself in a relationship with someone who is repressing their emotions, it's essential to recognize the signs of this dynamic and understand that their emotional outbursts are not your fault. They're simply the result of years of suppressed feelings that have reached a breaking point. Jung's teachings remind us that the shadow is not something to be feared or avoided. It is a natural part of who we are, and only by acknowledging and integrating it can we achieve true emotional health and balance. Repressing our darker emotions may seem like a way to maintain control, but in reality, it only creates more problems down the line. The key is not to suppress, but to confront and understand these emotions, so that we can live more authentically and harmoniously with ourselves and others. The moral controller is a particularly insidious type of person who uses their sense of moral superiority as a weapon to control, manipulate, and dominate those around them. While they often present themselves as paragons of virtue and morality, their true intentions are far less noble. These individuals tend to project their repressed desires, emotions, and weaknesses onto others, condemning them for behaviors that they themselves secretly struggle with or deny. In their worldview, they're always right, and anyone who deviates from their standards of behavior is wrong, immoral, or inferior. This creates an atmosphere where guilt and shame are used as tools to maintain control, leaving those around them feeling inadequate, self-conscious, and constantly on edge. The moral controller often cloaks their manipulation in the guise of righteousness, virtue, and good intentions. They are quick to offer unsolicited advice, often dressed up as guidance or help, all while subtly undermining the self-esteem of others. In their mind, they are simply helping those around them become better, more virtuous people. However, what they don't realize, or perhaps refuse to acknowledge, is that their actions are rooted in a deep sense of insecurity and self-righteousness, not a genuine desire to help. This dynamic creates a toxic environment where those on the receiving end of the moral controller's judgment start to internalize their criticism, eventually doubting their own values, beliefs, and decisions. I had a relative who was a perfect example of a moral controller. This person was always the first to offer their opinion on others' lives, particularly when it came to decisions they deemed morally questionable. Whether it was my career choices, relationships, or even my hobbies, nothing escaped their judgment. They would frequently tell me that I wasn't living up to my potential, that I was wasting my time on pursuits they didn't approve of, or that I should get my priorities straight. They presented themselves as someone who had everything figured out, as if they were a walking moral compass who could do no wrong. I often found myself questioning my own decisions because, at the time, their criticisms seemed so pointed, so well-intentioned, that it was hard to refute them. What I didn't realize at the time was that my relatives' harsh criticisms were not coming from a place of genuine care or concern. Rather, they were a form of projection. Their constant condemnation of my choices was rooted in their own repressed desires, things they wanted, but had suppressed for years due to their rigid, self-imposed moral code. For example, my relative had always been unhappy with their career, but had never had the courage to pursue their passion. Instead of confronting these feelings of regret or unfulfilled ambition, they projected them onto me, convincing themselves that I was the one making poor choices. Their criticisms were less about my decisions and more about their own inner turmoil that they couldn't or wouldn't confront. At first, I didn't realize the extent to which their judgment was affecting me. I began to doubt myself, wondering if I was truly making the right decisions in my life. I questioned my motivations, wondering if I was being selfish or irresponsible by following my passions. This sense of self-doubt grew over time as my relatives' judgments became more frequent and more critical. I started to feel guilty for things I hadn't even done wrong, and I found myself trying to justify my actions to someone who wasn't even interested in listening, only in correcting me. The moral superiority they displayed made me feel small, as though I was the one who had it all wrong and needed their correction. Eventually, I began to recognize that this constant barrage of judgment was wearing me down. It wasn't just the unsolicited advice that bothered me, it was the underlying manipulation disguised as virtue. The more I tried to explain myself or assert my own decisions, the more my relative would double down, claiming that I just didn't understand what was best for me. This created a toxic dynamic where I started to internalize their judgments, even though deep down I knew that my decisions were right for me. The constant barrage of better ways to live made me question my own instincts, and I became less confident in my ability to make choices for myself. The turning point for me came when I realized that the root of my relatives' criticisms was not concern for my well-being, but a projection of their own unmet needs and desires. They couldn't tolerate seeing me make decisions that went against their rigid moral framework, and they couldn't bear the idea of me pursuing goals that didn't align with their sense of what was correct. Their moral judgment was a defense mechanism, a way to control me and others by making us feel guilty for not adhering to their narrow view of the world. Once I saw this for what it was, I was able to detach myself from their manipulation and stop questioning my own decisions based on their criticisms. Jung's teachings on projection offer a profound insight into how the moral controller operates. Projection is a psychological mechanism in which an individual attributes their own unacceptable feelings, desires, or impulses onto others. In the case of the moral controller, they are unable or unwilling to confront their own desires, weaknesses, or imperfections. Instead of facing these uncomfortable aspects of themselves, they project them onto others, creating a sense of superiority and control by condemning others for their flaws. This not only prevents them from growing emotionally, but it also sabotages their relationships, as they create an environment of guilt and shame. The key takeaway from this experience is that the moral controller's manipulation is often disguised as virtuous behavior. They position themselves as the moral authority, offering unsolicited advice, judgment, and criticism, all while masking their own repressed desires. Their moral superiority is a shield that protects them from confronting their own inner conflicts and flaws. By projecting their unresolved issues onto others, they maintain a sense of control and dominance, convincing themselves that they are right while everyone else is wrong. However, this facade is ultimately destructive not just for the people they try to control, but for themselves as well. Living with a moral controller can be incredibly challenging because their manipulation is subtle and often wrapped in a veneer of good intentions. Unlike overtly aggressive or manipulative individuals, the moral controller makes you feel guilty and ashamed for simply being yourself. They may use phrases like, "I'm just trying to help you," or "you'll thank me later," to justify their criticism, further reinforcing the idea that they are doing you a favor by pointing out your flaws. However, their real goal is not to help, but to control, to make you feel inferior and dependent on their judgment. One of the most harmful effects of living with a moral controller is the erosion of your self-confidence. Over time, you begin to doubt your own beliefs and decisions, questioning whether you're truly making the right choices or if you're just being selfish or immoral in their eyes. This constant self-doubt can lead to a sense of confusion and insecurity, as you're left trying to meet someone else's standards instead of staying true to your own values. In relationships, the moral controller can create an unhealthy dynamic where one person's voice dominates and the other becomes passive or submissive. The person being controlled feels as though their own opinions and desires are less important than the moral framework imposed by the controller. Over time, this can lead to resentment, frustration, and emotional distance, as the controlled person may begin to feel suffocated by the constant judgment. The key to recognizing and dealing with a moral controller is to understand that their criticism is not about your behavior. It is about their inability to confront their own unresolved issues. Their judgment is not a reflection of who you are, but rather a projection of their own fears and desires. It is essential to recognize when someone's moral superiority is actually a form of control rather than guidance. By understanding this dynamic, you can begin to protect yourself from their manipulation and reclaim your own sense of autonomy and self-worth. The first step in breaking free from the influence of a moral controller is to develop a strong sense of self-awareness and self-acceptance. Recognize that you are not responsible for meeting someone else's moral standards and that your decisions, as long as they are authentic to you, are valid. Don't allow someone else's projections to dictate your worth or your actions. Remember, the true measure of morality is not found in rigid rules and external judgment, but in the integrity of your own values and the authenticity of your actions. In conclusion, the moral controller's manipulation is often disguised as virtuous behavior, but it is, in reality, a form of control that uses guilt and shame to dominate others. By recognizing this manipulation and understanding the underlying psychological dynamics at play, you can free yourself from their influence and begin to live more authentically. Understanding that moral superiority is often a defense mechanism for their own repressed desires will allow you to see the person for who they truly are, and not as the moral authority they claim to be. The complex person is an individual who is driven by unresolved emotional wounds, often from past trauma, experiences, or relationships. These emotional wounds, which Jung referred to as complexes, become like hidden triggers that dominate a person's behavior and perception of the world. These complexes shape how they react to situations, often causing disproportionate and unpredictable emotional responses. Living with or interacting with a complex person can feel like walking on a psychological minefield, where each day brings a new set of emotional explosions that seem disconnected from the present moment, but are actually deeply rooted in past hurts. The emotional volatility that these individuals display can be exhausting and confusing for those around them, as their reactions can seem entirely out of proportion to the situation at hand. A complex, as defined by Carl Jung, is a cluster of unresolved emotions, memories, and desires that are stored in the unconscious mind. These complexes are formed when an individual experiences a traumatic or emotionally intense event, but instead of processing these emotions, they are repressed. As a result, these emotions do not disappear. Instead, they remain dormant in the unconscious, waiting for an opportunity to surface. When the individual encounters situations that unknowingly trigger these repressed emotions, the complex is activated, and the person's emotional reaction becomes distorted and exaggerated. These emotional reactions are often out of sync with the present moment, as they are driven by the complex, not by the actual situation. I once had a close friend who exhibited all the classic signs of a complex person. At first, I thought their sudden emotional shifts were just part of their personality. One moment, they would be affectionate, warm, and engaging, and the next, they would snap and become angry, distant, or withdrawn. I never understood why their mood would change so rapidly. It was as though something minor, a misplaced word, or a casual remark could set them off, sending them into a state of intense emotional turmoil. For a long time, I chalked it up to their temperament. I believed that they were just overly sensitive or had a short fuse. But as time passed, I began to realize that their emotional outbursts were much deeper than I had initially thought. I started to notice patterns in their behavior, particularly when we were in emotionally charged situations. They would react with anger or sadness to situations that, on the surface, seemed relatively insignificant. A simple disagreement, for example, could lead to an all-out argument where they would accuse me of things I hadn't said or done. Their anger seemed almost disproportionate to the situation, and it took me a while to understand that these outbursts were not necessarily about what was happening at that moment, but about something buried deep within them. As I got to know them better, I began to see that their reactions were deeply tied to past traumas and unresolved issues they had never processed. For instance, one day we were having a casual conversation about a mutual friend, and I made a comment that was, in hindsight, fairly innocuous. However, my friend suddenly became very defensive and upset, accusing me of betraying them by speaking ill of this person. Their reaction was extreme and completely out of proportion to the comment I had made. In that moment, I was shocked, and I tried to explain that I wasn't attacking anyone. But no matter how much I reassured them, their anger only escalated. Afterward, when they had calmed down, they admitted that the situation reminded them of a past betrayal they had experienced in a previous friendship. They told me they had never fully healed from that experience. And whenever something remotely similar came up, it triggered that old emotional pain. At that moment, everything clicked. I realized that my friend's anger and emotional volatility were not caused by the present situation, but by past trauma that had not been fully processed or understood. Their emotional responses were a direct result of the complex they were carrying. The past betrayal had left them emotionally scarred, and every time something triggered that wound, it would reopen, causing an exaggerated and disproportionate reaction. This insight helped me understand my friend better, and it also helped me to stop taking their emotional outbursts personally. What I initially saw as random or unpredictable behavior was actually a symptom of a much deeper, unresolved emotional issue. Jung's concept of complexes helps explain why the complex person's reactions can seem so disconnected from the situation at hand. Their emotional responses are not based on the present reality, but on the echoes of past experiences that continue to haunt them. These complexes are like emotional landmines that lie hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be triggered. What seems like a small issue to one person could be a deeply traumatic trigger for the complex person, causing them to react in ways that seem irrational or out of proportion. It's important to recognize that these responses are not deliberate, nor are they consciously controlled. The person is not intentionally trying to be difficult. Rather, they are reacting to something within themselves that they have not yet dealt with. Living with a complex person can be emotionally draining. The unpredictability of their emotional responses can leave others feeling as though they are constantly walking on eggshells. One moment, everything might be fine, and the next, a small comment or a minor disagreement could trigger a full-blown emotional outburst. The emotional volatility of the complex person can create an atmosphere of tension and instability, where others feel as though they're never quite sure what to expect. This can lead to confusion, frustration, and even resentment, as those around them may feel as though they are constantly being blamed for something they didn't cause or that they don't fully understand. For example, imagine being in a relationship with someone who is emotionally complex. They may seem loving and affectionate one moment, and the next they pull away, becoming angry or distant without any clear explanation. Their anger may be triggered by something seemingly insignificant, like a minor miscommunication or a change in plans. However, their response is far more intense than the situation warrants, and the person on the receiving end is left feeling bewildered and hurt. The emotional ups and downs can be exhausting, and over time, it becomes difficult to know how to respond to the person's emotional needs without triggering a negative reaction. This constant emotional instability can create an unhealthy dynamic, where both individuals are caught in a cycle of misunderstanding and frustration. Understanding the root of the complex person's behavior is crucial in managing interactions with them. It's important to remember that their emotional outbursts are not about you, but about the unresolved wounds they carry. When you can recognize that their reactions are tied to past trauma, it becomes easier to detach emotionally and avoid internalizing their behavior. Instead of feeling blamed or misunderstood, you can approach the situation with compassion and understanding, recognizing that their emotional volatility is a defense mechanism that has developed over time. However, while it is important to be compassionate and patient, it is also essential to establish boundaries. The emotional volatility of the complex person can be draining, and if you don't set healthy boundaries, you may find yourself constantly sacrificing your own emotional well-being to accommodate their needs. In some cases, the complex person may not even realize the toll their behavior is taking on those around them. They may not recognize that their emotional reactions are excessive or damaging, and they may expect others to always accommodate their emotional needs without question. Jung's teachings offer valuable insight into how to navigate relationships with complex people. One of the key takeaways is the importance of recognizing the unconscious dynamics at play. When you understand that the person's emotional reactions are driven by unresolved pain, you can approach the situation with more empathy and less judgment. Instead of reacting to their outbursts, you can offer support and understanding, while also maintaining healthy boundaries to protect your own emotional well-being. Another key takeaway is the importance of self-awareness. The complex person may not be aware of the emotional triggers that control their behavior, but you can take responsibility for your own emotional reactions. By understanding your own emotional triggers and reactions, you can better manage your responses to the complex person's behavior, ensuring that you don't get swept up in their emotional turmoil. This can help you maintain a sense of stability and emotional resilience, even when faced with their unpredictable reactions. Ultimately, the complex person's emotional volatility is a reflection of unresolved pain and trauma that needs to be addressed. While it's important to be understanding and compassionate, it is also crucial to recognize the need for healing and self-awareness. Until the complex person confronts their emotional wounds, they will continue to be controlled by their complexes, causing emotional turmoil for themselves and those around them. Helping someone heal from their past trauma requires patience, empathy, and a willingness to support them in their journey towards self-discovery and integration. However, it is also important to recognize that healing is ultimately their responsibility, and you cannot heal them for them. By understanding the dynamics of complexes and learning how to manage your interactions with the complex person, you can foster healthier, more balanced relationships while also protecting your own emotional health. The psychic vampire is a type of person who may not display overt aggression or hostility, but instead drains your emotional energy in a much more insidious and subtle way. They do this by manipulating your emotions, playing the role of the victim, and demanding constant attention and support from you, all while giving little or nothing in return. Over time, they siphon off your energy, leaving you feeling emotionally exhausted and unfulfilled, yet still demanding more. Their need for attention can be unrelenting, and the more you give, the less satisfied they seem to be, creating an exhausting cycle of emotional parasitism. The psychic vampire feeds on your energy without ever directly taking it. They simply make you feel emotionally drained, isolated, and ineffective in your own life. This dynamic can be incredibly difficult to recognize at first because the psychic vampire often appears to be in genuine need. They may present themselves as someone who is struggling or facing overwhelming challenges. Initially, helping them may feel like a natural response, especially if you're an empathetic person. You may feel a sense of duty to offer your time, your support, and your understanding. At first, their emotional pleas for help might seem reasonable, even urgent, and you may feel like you're doing a good deed by being there for them. But as time goes on, you begin to realize that no matter how much you give, the relationship feels one-sided, and you're left feeling drained, unappreciated, and emotionally empty. This was something I experienced with a close friend. When I first met them, they seemed to be going through a particularly tough time in their life, struggling with family issues, career dissatisfaction, and a sense of isolation. As a compassionate person, I naturally wanted to help. I listened to their problems, offered advice, and tried to be a source of emotional support. I believed that by helping them, I was making a difference in their life. However, over time, something started to feel off. No matter how much time and emotional energy I devoted to supporting them, they always seemed to need more. They constantly demanded attention. And whenever I tried to express my own needs or share my own challenges, they either dismissed me or made the conversation about them. It wasn't long before I realized that I was being emotionally drained. The more I helped, the more they seemed to need, but nothing ever seemed to improve. They would repeat the same stories, seek advice that they never acted upon, and continue to complain about the same issues without making any real effort to resolve them. I found myself spending hours listening to their woes, only for them to walk away unchanged, as though my efforts had been in vain. Over time, this took a toll on me. I began to feel emotionally exhausted, as though I was giving and giving, yet I was getting nothing in return. What started as an act of kindness turned into an emotional burden. I felt like I was a constant source of energy for them, but no matter how much I provided, they were never satisfied. This is the essence of a psychic vampire. One of the most difficult aspects of dealing with a psychic vampire is that they do not necessarily appear harmful. Unlike more overtly manipulative individuals, they don't demand anything outright or try to control you through forceful means. Instead, they subtly manipulate your emotions, making you feel guilty for not being there for them, or convincing you that they are in desperate need of support. They may even feign vulnerability or selflessness in order to draw you in. However, as their demands grow and their emotional dependency increases, it becomes clear that they are not seeking genuine help. They are seeking to drain your emotional energy without any intention of reciprocating or addressing their own issues. Jung's concept of the psychic vampire could be seen as an extension of his broader theories on the unconscious and the ways in which individuals can unconsciously project their unresolved needs onto others. In the case of the psychic vampire, they're unaware or refuse to acknowledge that they are relying on others to meet their emotional needs. Their unconscious mind creates a parasitic dynamic, where they are essentially using others to feed their emotional hunger. The energy they take from you may not be obvious or physical, but it can leave you feeling emotionally drained, mentally exhausted, and spiritually empty. The key difference between a psychic vampire and someone who is genuinely in need of help is that the latter is willing to take responsibility for their own emotional growth and healing. While it is natural for people to go through difficult times and seek support from others, the psychic vampire relies on others to fulfill their emotional needs without ever doing the work themselves. They do not seek to resolve their issues. They simply want to feed off the energy of those around them, hoping that their emotional well-being will be sustained by others. At first, the experience of helping a psychic vampire might feel rewarding. You may believe that you are making a positive impact in their life, providing them with the emotional support they need to heal or grow. However, as you continue to invest your time and energy, you begin to notice the imbalance. You may offer support, but they never seem to improve or take any concrete steps toward bettering their situation. This can leave you feeling stuck, as though you're going in circles and not making any progress in the relationship. One of the most profound realizations in dealing with a psychic vampire is the recognition of emotional parasitism. The psychic vampire feeds on your empathy, your attention, and your emotional labor, but they rarely give anything back. They create an emotional vacuum where they drain your energy without ever replenishing it. This can leave you feeling empty, unappreciated, and disconnected from your own emotional needs. The more you give, the more they seem to demand, and the less satisfied they become, leaving you wondering if your efforts are even making a difference. The energy you provide is never enough because their emotional hunger is infinite and unsatisfied. In order to protect your mental health from the draining effects of a psychic vampire, it is essential to recognize the signs of emotional parasitism early on. These individuals often disguise their demands as acts of vulnerability or neediness. But underneath this facade lies a deeper issue of emotional dependency. They do not want to heal or grow on their own. They want to remain dependent on others for their emotional sustenance. This can create an unhealthy dynamic where you feel responsible for their emotional well-being, even though you have no power to fix their underlying issues. Setting boundaries is key when dealing with a psychic vampire. You must learn to recognize when you're being emotionally drained and take steps to protect your energy. This may involve limiting the amount of time you spend with them, being clear about your own emotional needs, and refusing to take on their emotional burdens. Setting boundaries is not about abandoning them or refusing to help them. It's about recognizing that you cannot save someone who is unwilling to save themselves. In order to maintain your own emotional health, you must learn to protect your energy and not allow others to drain it without offering anything in return. Recognizing the patterns of emotional parasitism in a relationship is vital to maintaining your mental and emotional well-being. It's important to ask yourself whether your interactions with a particular person are leaving you feeling energized and fulfilled, or if you're constantly giving without receiving. If you feel emotionally drained after spending time with someone, it's crucial to assess whether the relationship is healthy or if it is feeding into a cycle of emotional depletion. By setting boundaries and being mindful of the energy you're giving to others, you can protect yourself from the subtle manipulation of a psychic vampire and ensure that your emotional resources are being used in a way that nurtures rather than depletes you. It's also important to recognize that a psychic vampire is not necessarily a bad person. They may be deeply insecure, struggling with unresolved issues, or lacking the emotional tools to care for themselves. However, this does not mean that you are obligated to bear the weight of their emotional needs. Everyone has a right to their own emotional space and well-being, and it is essential to prioritize your own mental health in relationships. Helping someone does not mean sacrificing your own well-being in the process. By recognizing the signs of emotional parasitism and setting clear boundaries, you can protect yourself from the draining effects of a psychic vampire while still maintaining compassion and empathy for their struggles. In the end, recognizing and addressing the presence of a psychic vampire in your life is crucial for maintaining your emotional health. These individuals can leave you feeling empty and unfulfilled, but with awareness and boundaries, you can prevent them from draining your energy. Protecting your emotional well-being is not about being selfish. It is about ensuring that you have the strength and resources to support both yourself and others in a healthy, balanced way. Carl Jung's psychological theories offer profound insights into the dynamics of human behavior, particularly the unconscious forces that shape our interactions. He teaches us that the most dangerous people in our lives are often not the overt villains or those who openly harm us, but rather those whose unconscious patterns subtly manipulate and control the flow of our emotional and mental energy. These individuals, operating from deep, unrecognized emotional wounds, project, repress, or project their unresolved issues onto others, pulling us into complex, dysfunctional relationships. What makes them so dangerous is that we don't always see their manipulation coming. It operates under the radar, behind masks of charm, empathy, and even good intentions. The key to protecting ourselves is not to identify the obvious manipulators, but to become aware of these subtle dynamics that take root in our unconscious minds and in the minds of those we interact with. The foundation of this awareness begins with an understanding of our own unconscious processes. As Jung teaches, the unconscious is a powerful force within us, often determining how we react, what we desire, and how we perceive the world. It is the seat of our shadows, those parts of ourselves that we suppress, reject, or fail to acknowledge. These shadows are often the most dangerous aspects of our personality because they lie outside of our conscious awareness, yet they shape our behavior and interactions in profound ways. We may project them onto others, treating them as if they're the enemy, or we may repress them entirely, causing us to react disproportionately to seemingly minor events. Often, these unconscious behaviors arise when we feel threatened by a situation or relationship that reflects our unresolved fears, desires, or emotions. This is where our true freedom lies, recognizing these unconscious patterns and integrating them into our conscious awareness. By learning about these psychological patterns, I become more aware of the dynamics in my relationships and within myself. I've come to realize that many of the challenges I face with others are not simply external problems, but are deeply connected to my own unconscious patterns. These realizations have helped me set healthier boundaries, as I now recognize when a relationship dynamic is veering into the territory of manipulation or emotional parasitism. Understanding that these patterns are not necessarily conscious or deliberate gives me the ability to interact with people in a more mindful and authentic way. Instead of reacting defensively or feeling guilty for behaviors that were not mine to own, I now feel empowered to take a step back and assess the underlying dynamics at play. This has allowed me to engage in more genuine and fulfilling relationships, where I am not constantly caught in a cycle of emotional manipulation or projection. Self-awareness is the cornerstone of true emotional freedom. Once we begin to recognize these unconscious behaviors, whether in ourselves or others, we start to break free from the automatic patterns that have been controlling our actions. We no longer respond mindlessly to triggers, nor do we allow others to project their unprocessed emotions onto us without our consent. Instead, we begin to engage with the world in a conscious way, choosing how to respond based on our true values and understanding, rather than on ingrained patterns from our past. This doesn't mean we become perfect or free of conflict, but it means that we no longer let unconscious forces dictate our emotional lives. Take, for example, how I used to react in certain friendships. I had a tendency to attract people who were emotionally volatile individuals who would swing between extreme affection and sudden outbursts of anger or withdrawal. Initially, I assumed that these people's reactions were just part of their personality, but as I began to understand Jung's theories of projection and repression, I realized that my friends' behaviors were often a reflection of their own unresolved emotional wounds. They projected their anger, sadness, or frustration onto me, and I became the unconscious target of their emotional patterns. At the time, I didn't understand why their emotional swings left me feeling confused and drained. But after learning about the unconscious dynamics that Jung describes, I recognized that I had been absorbing their unresolved emotional baggage, not because I was to blame, but because they had unconsciously chosen me as the vessel for their unprocessed feelings. This awareness changed everything. By recognizing that their emotional triggers were not about me, I was able to stop taking their behavior personally. I learned to detach emotionally from their reactions, knowing that their outbursts were simply projections of their own unresolved issues. I could still offer support, but I no longer felt responsible for their emotional stability or healing. This shift in perspective allowed me to preserve my own emotional well-being while still maintaining relationships based on mutual respect and understanding. I was no longer trapped in the emotional turmoil of their unconscious projections, nor was I allowing my own unresolved issues to unconsciously influence my relationships. I had become more conscious of the roles I was playing in my interactions, which in turn empowered me to make healthier choices and engage with others more authentically. It's important to note that the journey towards self-awareness isn't a one-time event, but a continuous process. We all carry shadows, the parts of ourselves that we are reluctant to acknowledge or confront. These shadows can include desires, fears, insecurities, or traits that we deem undesirable or unacceptable. It is natural to want to push these aspects of ourselves away. But as Jung reminds us, what we repress does not simply disappear. It festers in the unconscious, often influencing our behavior in ways we are unaware of. This is why self-awareness is such a powerful tool. When we make the unconscious conscious, we stop being controlled by these hidden forces. We no longer react out of fear, anger, or unacknowledged pain, but instead, we respond with clarity, compassion, and authenticity. For example, I remember feeling overwhelmed by feelings of guilt and inadequacy in a particular relationship. I had a tendency to over-apologize, even when I hadn't done anything wrong, because I feared conflict and rejection. As I began to explore these feelings more deeply, I realized that this behavior was rooted in past experiences where I had been unfairly blamed for situations I didn't cause. Instead of confronting these emotions at the time, I repressed them, and they manifested in my adult relationships as a constant need to please others. Recognizing this pattern allowed me to understand why I behaved the way I did. I had been projecting my unresolved childhood feelings of inadequacy onto my adult relationships. And once I acknowledged this, I could begin to make conscious choices about how to communicate and assert myself. I no longer had to apologize for my existence or feel responsible for others' emotions. By recognizing and integrating these unconscious patterns, I was able to break free from the cycle of self-repression and live more authentically. One of the greatest gifts of self-awareness is the ability to set healthy boundaries. When we are unaware of the unconscious forces driving our actions, we're more likely to allow others to manipulate us, knowingly or unknowingly. We may feel guilty for asserting our needs or believe that we are responsible for others' emotions. But once we become aware of these dynamics, we can assert our own needs, protect our emotional well-being, and avoid falling into patterns of emotional manipulation. Boundaries are essential to preserving our mental health and ensuring that our relationships are based on mutual respect rather than unconscious control. The process of integrating the unconscious into our conscious awareness is not always easy. It requires courage, vulnerability, and a willingness to face the parts of ourselves that we may not like or accept. But the rewards of this journey are profound. As we shed light on our unconscious patterns, we stop being controlled by them. We become more aware of our emotional triggers, our desires, and our fears, and we can make conscious choices about how to respond to situations and people. We stop living on autopilot and begin to live more intentionally, authentically, and fully. And as we recognize these unconscious patterns in others, we can engage with them in a more compassionate and conscious way, free from the distortions of projection, repression, or manipulation. Ultimately, the path to true freedom lies in self-awareness. By making the unconscious conscious, we free ourselves from the hidden forces that shape our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. This is the essence of individuation, the process of becoming the fullest, most authentic version of ourselves. By acknowledging our shadows, integrating our unconscious parts, and setting healthy boundaries, we can live more consciously and authentically, creating healthier relationships and a more fulfilling life. The more we shed light on our unconscious, the less it controls us, and the more we are able to live in alignment with our true selves. So, after delving into the psychological patterns that can subtly manipulate our emotions and behavior, what's the real takeaway from today's video? The most important lesson is self-awareness. We are all walking around with unconscious patterns that shape our reactions, our decisions, and, most importantly, how we interact with others. The key to protecting ourselves from being emotionally drained, manipulated, or trapped in unhealthy dynamics is to first recognize these forces both in others and in ourselves. Whether it's recognizing projection, understanding the persona, acknowledging repressed emotions, or learning to set healthy boundaries with people who drain our energy, the first step is always awareness. As Carl Jung brilliantly put it, what you resist persists, and the more we ignore our unconscious shadows, the more they control us. By becoming aware of these unconscious forces, we not only gain control over our emotional lives, but we also open the door to authentic, fulfilling relationships where we are no longer at the mercy of unseen dynamics. But here's the thing, awareness alone isn't enough. It requires action to change the way we engage with others and how we protect our own mental health. Recognizing these behaviors in others gives us the power to set boundaries and protect ourselves. But it's just as important to look within and ask ourselves, am I projecting? Am I repressing emotions that need to be dealt with? These questions are key to making sure that we don't fall into the trap of emotional manipulation, whether we're the one doing it or the one on the receiving end. Now, I hope you found this video insightful and empowering. If so, please remember to like this video, share it with anyone who could benefit from this knowledge, and subscribe for more content like this. Your support really helps us keep creating these videos and bringing you valuable content each week. If you want to go a step further and support the channel, consider donating through Super Thanks. Your generous donations keep the wheels turning here at your channel name. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Stay aware, stay strong, and always prioritize your emotional health.